Now, Elizabeth, if the story is true, was very cunning in how she went about replying. She refused to write a reply and was said to have told the messenger that she would do what God intended her to do, which is very clever because you're not giving a direct answer, you're not saying yes, you're not saying no. So either side that wins, she's hoping to still benefit, if that story is true. Now, the main issue is that the Queen's Court, Queen Mary's Court, discovered this. When we say discovered, it could just all be a rumour, and it was one of her many Catholic followers that wanted rid of Elizabeth that was making it up. But like I said, we can't truly be sure. There's historical accounts for all sorts of things, but who knows what's really true. Now, when word was sent to Elizabeth that it was time to come and speak to Queen Mary, because Mary wanted Elizabeth to be watched. She wanted the Privy Council and the government to be able to keep an eye on Elizabeth's behaviour. Now, Elizabeth said she was too sick to travel, and she wasn't lying. 3 physicians were sent via Mary down to Elizabeth, who was staying just outside of London, and they did say that yes, she was sick, but she could travel. So they picked her up and she travelled in. We can imagine Elizabeth is already terrified of her fate. She was an anxious woman anyway, and now she's passing these heads on spikes, and that's the main reason she's been summoned. So what's going to happen to her? Mary refuses to see Elizabeth. Elizabeth has to answer to the council. The council don't trust her, but there was no evidence on Elizabeth because there was nothing in writing. So they couldn't instantaneously condemn her. They couldn't just find her guilty and sentence her to treason because there was no evidence. And this is the heir to the throne. You can't just cut that person's head off. There has to be a genuine reason. Now, Elizabeth finds out that she's in big trouble heading to the Tower. She makes a last-ditch attempt to plead to Mary. She writes to Mary, which is a very emotional letter. Now, Elizabeth was very well educated. She was very good at literature and language. And the letter is very emotive because the letter begins in her usual professional style. Fantastic, very artistic. And towards the end of the letter, where you can tell that her anxieties are getting on top of her, where she realizes the seriousness of this letter, you see the writing deteriorate and therefore her mental state at the time. And to make sure no one could write underneath, no one could pretend to be her, she drew lines across the page to make sure that the Queen knew exactly what she had said before signing at the bottom, "Your loyal Elizabeth." This letter had only bought Elizabeth an extra evening. Unfortunately, Mary was not interested in the letter, which means the following morning, at low tide, Elizabeth would be sailed down the river to the Tower of London. Now, accounts tell us that she was brought in by this entrance, which is a very famous entrance in London. This is St Thomas Tower, which is also known as Traitor's Gate. Now, the Tower of London is one of the most macabre and, dare I say, evil places to exist that humans have created in the entire world. The history behind this place is as fascinating as it is evil. You can look at many mansions and many artifacts that are as old as this, but they don't have that macabre history. And if you are Queen Elizabeth You believe you are heir to the throne, a loyal subject to the monarch. This is a besmirchment on not just yourself, but your legacy. Now, as she was brought down the river, she would have been absolutely terrified. And we know that Mary and Elizabeth both suffered from anxiety and manic depression. Despite the many accounts and the interesting accounts of Elizabeth coming in via Traitor's Gate and her interactions with the yeomen of the time, there are contemporary accounts which actually lead us to believe she didn't come through this entrance at all, but one further down this way with a drawbridge. Let's have a quick look. So the chances are it's more likely that Elizabeth actually came up these stairs, especially since her guilt hadn't been decided upon. It would have been a real besmirchment for her to come through Traitor's Gate. Traitor's Gate was reserved for people who were returning from court, usually, or people who were accused of the most heinous of things, like she was. But the Tower is a very special place. It's only reserved for either what we would today class as terrorists or incredibly important people. So the stories in the Tower will differentiate between the lowest classes possible to the highest classes possible, with very little in between. Elizabeth most likely came up these stairs and through the drawbridge just over there. So there's a far higher chance that Elizabeth actually came in via the Bywood Tower, via that door over there, meaning she would have walked over this drawbridge. It's said that when she turned up, she turned to the warden and said, "Oh Lord, I never thought to have come here as a prisoner."